At the offset of Bioshock 2's development, the creative team was given 3 mandates. 1. The game needed to launch on the PlayStation 3. 2. The game needed to feature a multiplayer mode. And 3. It must have been delivered within 2.5 years. So 2 technical demands and a time restraint. Notably though, there's no demands made on the story front, and as is often the case, the more power the creative director is able to exercise over the project, the more interesting the end product winds up being. Bioshock 2 is fondly remembered by those who still remember it, but where its predecessor got its time in the sun in the discourse of games as art, Bioshock 2 was nothing more than a footnote. Then Bioshock Infinite would usurp this game as the true successor to Bioshock, and its time in the sun was marked with heavy criticism, and the brand was damaged to such an extent that the original Bioshock has been mostly dropped from the gaming discourse. Infinite's failure to land with the critical audience and the immediate turnaround fans of the license had with it, I feel sort of extended farther than just to Infinite, because when Bioshock does get brought up, people are either discussing the first game or criticizing Infinite. Sometimes the second game gets a mention, but it's often lost in the shuffle, which is a real shame because this is a game very much worthy of the name, and while Infinite tried to expand on the meta-narrative ambitions of the original Bioshock, Bioshock 2 expands on the setting, story, and aesthetic. 2 games, both presented as sequels to the same title, who take radically different paths towards realizing that ambition. I'll cover Infinite one day, but I've had Bioshock 2 on the brain for a few years now, and it's finally time we talk about it. This is AesirAesthetics asking you, if you like the video, to comment with some of your own thoughts on the game as we proceed, because even the time I've relegated to this video will not be enough to touch on everything. Now then, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's dive in. Bioshock 2 is a part of the proud genome of games which trace their lineage back to Origin Systems and Looking Glass Studios. The Shock series began with System Shock 1, which was a cyberpunkification of the Ultima Immersive Sim style. This game DNA branches off in some interesting directions, and you'll find that basically anything good today can trace its origin back to Ultima, or Wizardry if it was made in Japan. The lineage that gave us Bioshock 2 goes Ultima Underworld, which I need to cover one of these days, System Shock 1, where the shock formula gets firmly established, System Shock 2, which has another parent in Thief the Dark Project, which is where the license's stealth and more tightly scripted horror ambience came into the picture, since Ken Levine, the future director of the first Bioshock, and the gang were using the Thief engine for System Shock 2. It then goes Bioshock, which is when they took the System Shock 2 formulation of the Immersive Sim and solved for making it more user-friendly, more mass-marketable, and more cinematic. I need to cover Ultima and Thief one of these days, but I've made videos on the rest of the Shock series games up until this one, so feel free to check those out if you feel uncomfortable in your knowledge of any of these titles. Bioshock 2 is actually a big outlier in the Shock series though, in that we've finally hit the point where the games shift from dramatically overhauling and rethinking the core Shock formula to instead polishing and refining what came before. The leaps in the processing powers of personal computers which occurred between System Shock 1 and 2 was why the second System Shock is such a big step from the first, and the same process repeats itself when we went from System Shock 2 to Bioshock 1. Also, Bioshock 1 was designed for a more casual console audience, which meant a lot of the esoteric design principles were pruned away. Bioshock 2's significantly shorter turnaround period allowed for very little industry changes, aside maybe from the horrendous trend of shoving multiplayer modes into everything, and so the game is a much more straightforward sequel than what the Shock series had had before. So the evolution of the Shock series takes a very strange turn here, where Bioshock 2 branches off from the main path and can't really trace its identity further back than one game. If we are looking at this as a Shock game, there's a lot of disappointment going around, but as that's not the creative intent, that's not what we'll be looking at. The creative lead of Bioshock 2 was Jordan Thomas. He worked on the Fort Frolic section of Bioshock 1 and was drafted by Ken Levine himself to do a pass on the entire first game to amp up the horror elements. and when he and his team initially came together, they laid down some core tenets for how they would go about designing the game. I love when developers talk openly about this because it makes understanding and evaluating the design of the final product so much easier. To them, it was important that 1, the game would feel fresh to newcomers and veterans of the first game alike. 2, he wanted to shock the player in ways they weren't expecting without straying too far from the expectations of the license. 3, the return to Rapture was an early decision made because they felt Rapture still had a lot of stories to tell. It can't have hurt that they had a bunch of pre-existing Rapture assets and concept art to work with. I went through a lot of interviews before making this video, and I really didn't find any notable mentions of System Shock acting as a guide for this license. It makes sense, Bioshock is very much its own thing, but a lot of the brand's identity comes from those games. The underwater city is an inspired setting. Jordan Thomas noted that Rapture, the setting, very much is a character unto itself, and this is a good observation. You understand the reasoning Andrew Ryan gives for why he chose to build this city. It really fleshes the man out that he did this, and it also gives you a glimpse of the surface world. But none of those rationales are the real reason for the setting. In reality, Ken Levine and the Irrational Games team wanted to recapture the cramped level design and isolated setting of System Shock 2, and they figured that an underwater city would impose a lot of the same restrictions as the spaceships in that game did. Obviously, I'm not saying Bioshock 2 should have tried to be System Shock 3, Deus Ex already did that, and like I said earlier, I'm not going to be using System Shock as any kind of club to beat up on this game with, but there's still something to exploring the evolution of these games, so expect the System Shocks to crop up in this video from time to time. I think the first great touch of the game is the choice of protagonist. When we start, we find ourselves in the role of a big daddy. If we want to find a presentation justification for this decision, it's notable that these guys are not affiliated with any faction in the world, making them outsiders in a sense, but they are still very much the products of Rapture, meaning we don't need an extended opening section where once again we come from the surface and find the city. They made this game knowing that a lot of players would be veterans of the first one, so being able to start in the city, which players would be acclimated to already, is a good touch. Gameplay-wise, the Big Daddy protagonist is smart because we get to toy around with all of the heavy weapons and plasmids in a much more combat-enabled body than we had in the first Bioshock. Bioshock 2 does not veer as far into the Immersive Sim sensibilities of its DNA as the first Bioshock did, and it also doesn't embrace the game-directed horror which the setting offers, quite like the first game did. I don't think it's unfair to say that this is the more action-focused Aliens to Bioshock 1's Alien. That's not a good or bad thing, just noting that they're going for different things. And I don't see how you could start off a more action-focused Bioshock better than to put the player in the body of a Big Daddy. When the game starts, we get a cutscene set before the fall of Rapture where Subject Delta, the player character, is doing a routine round with his little sister. The little sister in question is the kidnapped and genetically modified daughter of the game's villain, Sophia Lamb, Eleanor Lamb. And after Subject Delta was hit with a hypnotized plasmid, she appears and instructs him to take off his helmet and shoot himself in the head. The game's story can really be boiled down to the tug of war between Eleanor's biological parent and her spiritual parent, and forcing the two into this confrontation right at the start, I think, is a good touch. The theme of parentage returns from the first game with a vengeance. That game had the Objectivist antagonist, Andrew Ryan, come to the dark realization that Jack, the protagonist from there, was actually his genetically altered son sent to kill him. That game also had Dr. Tannenbaum, who returns here. She made the Little Sisters, and the justification she had for using the bodies of the little girls to host the Atom Slugs was that sympathy would deter most people from attacking the Little Sisters. In the first game, we see the ramifications of the horrors of idealogue play out, and we see what becomes of the characters made to play out in this setting. Dr. Tannenbaum herself got caught with the trick she herself employed, as she was gradually won over by the Little Sisters by her sympathy and becomes a motherly figure to them. In Jack, Andrew Ryan, the great individualist, is made to come face to face with a horrible counter to all of his ideals, since his son doesn't have any free will of his own. Frank Fontaine used the Atlas alias and lied about having a family to incite the sympathies of the player. In the opening of Bioshock 2, Subject Delta wakes up a decade after committing suicide. We are resurrected in a Vita chamber, and the telepathic Eleanor contacts us and begs for help. We learn from Dr. Tannenbaum that Eleanor is being held in Fontaine Futuristics, and so we have our heading. We also learn that if the two are not reunited, Subject Delta's heart will give out, meaning Eleanor must be saved now, because if she is brought to the surface, the world will be doomed and will be unable to save her, what with being dead and all. Eleanor is to be experimented upon by her mother, to create history's first true utopian, but Eleanor rejects her biological mother's wishes for her and instead reaches out to the adoptive father she was saddled with. On the theme of parentage, I'd say Bioshock 2 is handily superior to its predecessor, and Bioshock Infinite for that matter, in that the theme is not only the central focus this time around, with a lot more time dedicated to it, but it's also explored with the unique quirks of the license, like Adam. The first game established neatly that memories exist within Adam. You can recall the happenings observed by those who had the Adam in you before you did. This is the component which most interests Sophia Lamb, and she intends to infuse Eleanor with so much Adam that she'll possess the memory of Rapture's greatest minds. Afterwards, she intends to recreate the mental conditionings placed on Jack to destroy Eleanor's sense of self. Sophia is convinced that if Eleanor has no individuality and has the mental elite of Rapture in her head, she'll become a vessel through which Lamb's collectivist ideals can be imposed on the entire world. The parentage theme is also explored with the game's systems. At the end of the game, player choices are counted and tallied up, and Eleanor absorbs our Adam, and her perspective on the world will be informed by our actions in the game. The entire experience ultimately culminates in our in-game daughter modeling herself by observing the choices we made in our journey. Like I said, Bioshock 2 is much more committed to the theme of parentage than the other Bioshocks are. Bioshock 1 has received criticisms over the years for its refusal to commit to its anti-capitalist message, but this is a critique born of a misreading of the game. Ken Levine has gone on record stating that it's not a criticism of capitalism, or objectivism for that matter, but of idealogue. Andrew Ryan's failure was not that he lived by the wrong ideology, but that he let an abstract set of rules, divorced from the circumstances of real life, guide his actions. It could have been any ideology. The specific one was never the point, and Bioshock 2, I think, wisely doubles down on this sentiment by turning its back on the hardcore right-wing politics of Andrew Ryan towards the hardcore left-wing politics of Sophia Lamb. In the first game, Andrew Ryan's obsession with individualism was contrasted against his son Jack, who had no independent will at all, and there's a beautiful reversal of this in the second game, where Sophia's obsession with the collective is contrasted against the individualism of her daughter and Subject Delta. Sophia Lamb's placement in Rapture might feel a bit strange, but there's a lot of work done to retroactively incorporate her into the city's lore. Thank God for audio logs. The presentation of the story is very in keeping with what the Shock series is best at, where these audio logs are placed around the world for us to find. The audio logs allow for the story to be told in a non-linear sequence, and throughout our adventure, the presence of Sophia Lamb is explained. If an objectivist were to take umbrage with the presentation of Ryan's utopia in the first game, they could rest easy looking at Ryan not as a condemnation of Ayn Rand or her ideals, but a reiteration of what she wrote. In The Fountainhead, for example, Ellsworth Toohey establishes an art group consisting of nonconformists. Among their ranks are a man who wrote a novel without using a specific letter, I think it was E, and a playwright who deliberately writes bad plays. These artists all exist without any standards, and the point made of Peter Keating being inducted into their ranks in that book was to showcase how his pursuit of the second-hand life was leaving him spiritually hollowed out. He wanted to be a painter, but instead he studied architecture because his mother told him it was the only way he'd ever make money drawing. He fell in love with kind of a ditzy girl, but he abandoned her and married his boss's daughter to advance his career. All throughout that book, Ayn Rand hammers home the point of the horrors of living a life without value, and while Andrew Ryan himself comes across as a Howard Rourke or a Henry Reardon-esque character, his failure to integrate his values into all aspects of his life ultimately leads to his destruction. He built an objectivist paradise and then proceeded to fill it with people who have no love for his worldview. Case in point, Sophia Lamb. She was brought in to help people acclimate to the psychological stress of a life under the sea, but she used her position to induct her patients into the Rapture family cult. This obviously did not go down well with Ryan, and after some public debates on the matter, Ryan ultimately decided to ask Augustus Sinclair to deal with her. Sinclair being the Atlas/Shodan surrogate in this game. Someone who's constantly on our shoulders, who is very familiar with the setting and can quickly get us up to speed with what's going on. If the audio logs are there to tell the story of what happened, Sinclair is here to contextualize the narrative happening in front of us as it happens. The Shock series over the years had really refined the narrative presentation format, and here we also get to see the audio logs being used to try to achieve one of their core ambitions, which was making the game approachable by veterans and newcomers alike. Not only are we being familiarized with Rapture, we're being shown the three distinct faces of the city all at once. The original objectivist utopia, then the fallen hellscape built on its ruins, then the attempted collectivist utopia is on top of the fallen hellscape, and every instance of each of these distinct faces is coloring the environments at all times. The general rule of thumb in the environmental design seems to be that the deepest layer must abide by the objectivist standard, then there's a phase of destruction layered on top of it, and lastly, the collectivist utopianism is draped over the wreckage. I can't speak to how this reads to a newcomer since I had played the first game when I first played Bioshock 2, but if this was your first Bioshock, I'm genuinely interested in hearing if you had any issues parsing out the history of the place, or if the layered world building was tightly directed enough that the intent rang true. Let me know in the comments. On the topic of the world building, there's a lot of mileage the game gets by front-loading the Ryan Amusements section the way it does. Because if you don't already know the story of the place, if you're a newcomer to the license, they just give you a primer right there with a History of Rapture sequence in the park. Like its predecessor, the game is broken down into sections where we traverse one closed-off piece of the city at a time, and in Bioshock 2, these sections end with us making a morality choice to punish or forgive those who wronged us and or Eleanor in the past. That last bit is a shake-up from what we saw in the first game, but otherwise, this presentation format, where we finish sections of a large map while being guided by disembodied voices on the radio, is very much a Shock series staple. The progression layout is fairly simple, but it has some interesting ramifications on the larger experience which I feel warrant going over. Firstly, the actual theming for each area works best when it supports the happenings in the main narrative. So when we're dealing with the idea of betrayal, the setting should have betrayal running through it. This also applies to the story in a more abstract, structured way. So, when we are just beginning the game, the setting should work to teach us about the gameplay and the setting itself. I already noted that I like how the museum section in Ryan Amusements is front-loaded the way it is, but this philosophy to story structure is there all the way through if you look for it. So in the start of the game, we wake up in the Adonis Resorts area, which might be the most overt showcase of something Bioshock loves to do, which is to highlight the optimistic high-end attitude of its settings past with the dilapidated and collapsed state of the city right now. A luxury resort area reduced to ruin. On the ramifications of the progression layout of the game, while the main narrative is experienced and, more importantly, compartmentalized on a minute-to-minute basis, these sections are so clearly delineated from one another that they are more of an hour-to-hour deal. There's little to no spillover from one section to another, so each one is appraised in comparison to the others, which, with a few exceptions, I don't feel was ever the case in the Shock games prior to Bioshock 1. Yes, System Shock 1 is literally played level to level, but the game looked like this, so no floor quite had the distinct identity needed for the levels to really feel all that distinct. At least, that's how I feel. Since, when it came to developing the Bioshocks, the improved graphical fidelity allowed for tighter and more diverse area theming, it kinda naturally followed that this would be the case. And while there's a lot of positive downstreams of this change, a potential negative rears up in that the quality of scenario direction needs to be standardized across the entire experience, or else you're gonna get sections which instinctively feel less engaging to interact with than others, and the longer the game is, the more the player is going to be familiar with its tricks, meaning that it's probably a good idea to try to make each area really stand out from the rest. One way they do this is by constantly giving the players new weapons and introducing new enemy types. The actual levels also have very different functions in the world, so there's a hotel level, a prison, a shantytown with a lovely sequence in a diner, very cool, but, and I'm speaking for myself here, I can't help but feel the actual levels are a step down from the showing in the first game. And I think the reason level design feels different is because immersive sim and horror sensibilities are not as much the focus this time around as combat is. Meaning we have fewer vents to sneak through, fewer emotional little environmental storytelling dioramas to stumble into, fewer moments of having the game be tuned to the environment rather than the other way around. When it comes to the combat, I'm not exaggerating when I say Bioshock 2 is a big upgrade from the first game. But Bioshock 1's strength wasn't really in that as much as it was in the tragic ambiance and tight player direction. For all the flack Bioshock 1's late game got, for some reasons I've yet to understand, the game never dropped the ball when it came to making each area have a distinct voice. And while the levels in Bioshock 2 are by no means a disaster, I'm not seeing them lean into what I felt the best practices of the first game was, and I can't say this game has as many memorable moments as the first game did. Remember how in Arcadia we could stumble into those hidden caves behind the waterfalls and find those weird shamanic rituals? Bioshock 1 really excelled at utilizing the compact nature of its environments to create really unique and memorable locations. There's a lot of vents and hidden nooks and crannies all around. There was a lot of toying around with light and shadows, and you really got the sense that horror was on the developers' minds when they were designing those levels. Bioshock 2, I feel, really backslides on this front, and the ratio of horror set pieces to shooting galleries strays much further to the latter than the setup was in the first game. Popper's Drop being a prime example. This is where we meet Grace Holloway. She works for Sophia Lamb and is in charge of this level. Popper's Drop is a former railroad maintenance facility which has been transformed into a ramshackle housing district. A slum, basically. I love the diner. I must repeat my love for the diner. What a hero piece of this map. And I also like the layered world design where the new function of the area is just sort of draped over the old one, but both are still noticeable. But the actual level design feels more designed to bring out the best function of the enemies than to tightly direct the player's experience. Improving the enemy AI was actually a big focus for this game. The developers made it so that enemies can use cover from different heights. They can use tactical grenades, they can jump from ledges to get the drop on us, and there's just a bunch of new enemy types as well. The changed level design sensibilities might be downstream of wanting to really bring out the best of the enemies and finding that their pathfinding or whatever just could not be made to be elegant with the more cramped space we had in the first game, meaning the levels got opened up more and there's fewer instances of heavily scripted scenarios because to script them the levels needed to comply, and since there aren't as many obvious bottlenecks to funnel the player through here, it might just not have been possible to do a lot of those sequences. Alternatively, the developers might just have felt that the open-ended combat sections played better than the heavily scripted combat sections did. These guys did work on the first game and they played the crap out of it, so it might just be that they got burnt out on those sorts of sequences. Grace Holloway's story is explored in the Popper's Drop, and her beef with Subject Delta came about because he's kind of the culmination of everything she had come to hate about Rapture. She would criticize Ryan's administration of the place in her music and got blacklisted. Her lover was made to disappear when he became too vocal in his opposition to Ryan, and since they couldn't have any kids, she fell into a very deep depression. This led her to seek out Sophia Lamb, who took her into the family and convinced Grace to use her music for social activism. When Lamb was arrested, Grace was given custody of Eleanor, which was a double whammy because not only was this a very deep sign of love from Sophia, but it was also the child she was never able to have on her own. Enter Stanley Poole. When Ryan asked Sinclair to get rid of Lamb, Sinclair got Stanley, who was a reporter, to infiltrate the Rapture family and compromise Lamb. After that had been accomplished, she was taken to prison and Eleanor was sent to live with Grace. Poole was then put in charge of Dionysus Park, which Lamb had previously presided over, and when Eleanor ultimately confronted him about his financial mismanagement of her mother's assets, he pulled the oldest trick in the books and sold her off to the Fontaine orphanage, where she was transformed into a little sister. You couldn't do that today. After some time, Grace stumbled upon the little sister Eleanor walking with Subject Delta, and when she tried to reach out to her, Subject Delta broke her jaw. This ended her singing career, and you can kind of see how, from her perspective, Subject Delta kind of embodies everything that she was fighting against. She wanted better treatment for people, she got blacklisted. She loved a man, he was made to disappear. She wanted a child, it was taken away from her. And like the persecuted people of the first game, when the tables finally turn and she's given power, we see that she isn't obviously better at administrating just because she was done poorly in the past. We finally come face to face with her at the end of the Pauper's Drop section and get to choose to kill her or let her live. A choice we will not get for the next lieutenant of Sophia Lamb's, Father Simon Wales. I quite like that he's a priest because we get to see a bit of Sophia's mentality here. She doesn't really care about the messenger. She'll make her ideology wear whatever clothes she needs. When she needs to appeal to scientifically minded authorities, she'll reason with science, and when she has to appeal to the spiritually minded, she'll use religion. Simon and his brother Daniel were architects from Ireland, hired by Ryan to design Rapture itself. I guess he's the guy I get to talk to about how I'm not loving the changed sensibilities of the levels away from the tightly scripted little horror sequences into the more action-oriented brawlers and shooting arenas. Maybe if he'd have designed the rooms with more cramped little hallways, he wouldn't be such an easy boss, now would he? Anyways, the brothers stuck around after the construction of the city had finished, but when Rapture started to leak, Wales and Wales, their company, went bankrupt because they were unable to acquire any new clients. It's actually established that on the surface, Daniel and Simon constructed cathedrals, so religion was clearly on their minds, and when the leaking problem began in Rapture, Simon was overrun with guilt. Like Grace Holloway, he sought counseling with Sophia Lamb, and as he became more and more enthralled by her and her ideas, his religiosity was sparked and he took on the moniker Father Wales. This drove a wedge between the two brothers, and Simon's preaching of Lamb's collectivist ideals eventually led to him persecuting other religious groups. Once again, the persecuted becomes a tyrant. Andrew Ryan had scoffed at religion before, but he hadn't been systemically persecuting the people of faith. Ryan's death was eventually incorporated into Wales's mythology, with Jack being presented as a manifestation of God who came to punish those who prayed to the Great Chain. The Great Chain being the philosophy of Andrew Ryan. It's basically a reconceptualization of the invisible hand of the market, a social organizing mechanism which is too big and too deep and mysterious to be directed by any one entity. Interestingly, Jack had chains tattooed on his wrists, but unlike Ryan's invisible hand of the market, Jack's hands were very visible and were very much being manipulated. Anyways, Father Wales is confronted in a fairly conventional boss fight, and he cannot be spared. I'm not loving the design for Siren Alley, his location, but I do love what they did with it after the fight. We have to drain Dionysus Park to advance, but when we do, Lamb overloads the system, which results in Siren Alley being flooded, almost like a biblical judgment has been passed on the residents of our preacher. Walking around in the flooded Siren Alley might be my favorite section of the entire game. The exterior ocean walking sections are really cool, but I would have been very disappointed if those mechanics were not also utilized for some interior sections. I made a whole video about my love of urban exploration that one time, and walking around in an actual flooded city hits all the right notes for me. As you can see, I'm a big fan of tightly scripted scenarios and good player direction, and although I think the game is a step below the first one in this department, I do think the gameplay here is better. For one, we can dual-wield the plasmids and the weapons, unlike in the first game where we could only have either out at a time. I find this makes for a lot more on-the-fly combat experimentation, which I like, even though it does also emphasize the combat as more the focus this time around. There's not really a great emphasis placed on builds, and I think it has to do with the seeming prioritization of flow over depth. System Shock gave us a physical inventory to manage the guns, and because the inventory only had so much space, you needed to make a decision about what kind of a setup you were going to rock up to fights with. The choices there were commitments. Here, we have the gene tonics, which could have gone some ways to doing just that. So, things like the rivet gun and the spear gun could be qualified as tools which have been modified to be weapons, with special tonics set aside to boost the player's affinity with those. Then you could have heavy weapons and light weapons, and this fracturing of the builds would not only encourage replays, I feel, but since the gene tonics are often found in the levels, building out your character could be used to drive the player to do more exploring, which is where they could get more audio logs, more story, and get more immersed in the unfurling narrative. The best gene tonic in the game actually does lock the player on a single path. Drill Specialist cuts the EVE cost of using plasmids in half, but then locks every weapon except the drill away from the player, forcing them to adopt a new kind of mentality to the best tactics for encounters. The Bioshocks do not have a lot of heavy-duty stealth mechanics, meaning combat is always something you just need to engage with. This means that when it comes to fracturing the builds, it's not as much a question of asking the player how they want to confront the challenges ahead as it is how they are going to just fight the challenges ahead. The any choice is probably somewhat viable mentality of immersive sims like Deus Ex, which, as I noted, has very deep roots in the Shock series, is not on the table here, so every build is ultimately having the player answer the question, how do you want to fight? Because no gun is locked behind a paywall, the gene tonics and plasmids are where the build fracturing is mostly done. The gene tonic slots have been overhauled from the first game. Back then you had 3 classifications in engineering, physical, and combat, and each of those allowed up to 6 tonics to be equipped if the player had purchased the extra slots. In Bioshock 2, the upper limit to the gene tonics is preserved, 18, but the classifications no longer apply, meaning you can make every tonic a combat or engineering tonic if you want. This allows for optimization towards a certain build to the exclusion of the others, and I think this is actually one of the better changes in the game. Another change which really allows the admittedly limited build variety to shine, at least compared to the first game, is how much more money and ammo there is lying around. Here, if the player really likes a specific weapon, they can use that weapon and ignore the other ones. How, you ask? Why, just by buying a lot of ammo? With money? Also, the weapons don't get power crept nearly as hard as in the first game. Just compare the late game performance of the rivet gun here to the late game performance of the revolver in the first game. All in all, I'd say Bioshock 2 has vastly better combat than the first game. It's not even a comparison really, but it comes at the cost of emphasizing in the scenarios we encounter and the level design, the improved combat. If you want to toy around with the lingering immersive sim mechanics, which have made their way from the System Shocks into the Bioshocks, probably the second game is the better pick because while things like hacking and stealth, whatever stealth there was in these games, while these things are not as pronounced and viable as they were in the first game, when it comes to the fun part of the combat, there's so many more options available here than in the first game. Since fighting is so much more the point this time around, I genuinely don't even remember if we ever crouch after the Dionysus Park sequence. Because the combat is more the point, every other component of the experience feels like it has been warped to facilitate the improved combat. And again, this isn't really a case of better or worse, it's just trade-offs. If you want an atmospheric horror-tinged experience, probably the first Bioshock will gel better with you. But if you're willing to forego some of the scripted tightness for more experimentation and expressive combat, you'll probably get a lot more out of the second game. The combat also made its way into more components of the game, like the Little Sisters. In the first game we just killed the Big Daddies, which were protecting them, but here we have an additional protection minigame where the Little Sisters guide us to the bodies of dead civilians who they harvest while we protect them from splicers. Assuming you turn off the Vita chambers to make death matter a bit more, it's interesting that there's no way of failing these sections other than dying. The splicers can't steal or harvest the Little Sisters, they can't even reduce the amount of atom collected or anything like that. And on the Vita chambers. In Bioshock, death is really the only failure state in the game, but if you keep them on, death just means you are inconvenienced by the breaking up of the flow of the action and the time spent getting back to where you died at. I get that the Bioshocks are much more cinematic than the System Shocks, so having a feeling of things flowing is more important than in those games, but the gameplay here is so much less experimental that there's not a lot of mechanics to cobble together to create more interesting ways of handling this. I do prefer to turn the Vita chambers off, but even then, I feel that the save scumming technique isn't a perfect replacement to the Vita chambers, and I really feel like a new dedicated system would have been preferred. I'm usually the first to defend manual save points, ones which you have to locate in the map and make your way to lock in your progress. Silent Hill, my love. But here I'm not sure how they'd go over, since the combat really feels too fast and the enemies too hard hitting at times for a sneaky intelligent approach to be viable at all times. I kinda take it as a given that in any firefight I'm going to be hit here. I'm not really that bothered by the hand-wavy rationalizations given for why enemies can't use the Vita chambers, and I do like that they're actively trying to incorporate death into the actual plot of the game by rationalizing the failure and how the player comes back with a function in the world itself. But personally, I feel the same effect could have been accomplished by simply having the player be immortal, and instead of dying get stunned for a period of like 10 and 20 seconds. The input locking during the stun would act as punishment, and if we want to pile on this idea with something that might be way too much hassle to design for what it could be worth, maybe the player could actually be prone to being robbed while stunned. Then they'd have to chase the robber to get the money or ammo or health kits back. Losing resources, I feel, is always a good way to punish players. I'm not sure about this bit though. I feel like there's a lot of problems with just stunning the player and making them robbable. Breaks the flow of things quite a bit, you know? Which is something the Vita chambers actually do kinda solve for. The Vita chambers here are a streamlining of the Vita chambers from System Shock 2, but the best thing about those was removed for Bioshock 1, which was that back in System Shock 2, you needed to find the chambers and activate them in each area so that you could be resurrected there. If that was the setup in Bioshock 2, I feel like another change I'd welcome would be having the Vita chambers cost money to initially activate. So there'd be some decision making to be made in every area. Do you want to buy health, or do you want to save up so you can get the easy Vita chambers, which only lasts for one level? Then after completing a level, players might be encouraged to scrounge around for more cash, so they'll have the funds to activate the Vita chambers in the next level. Having a prominent gameplay target for players to search out in each level like this could also be incorporated into the storytelling and level design. So, imagine a level where the Vita chamber is locked in an office near the start. Instinctively, the player is going to want to get into that room, and voila, they have their heading without any character needing to say anything. For storytelling, imagine if prior to us reaching the Vita chamber near Alex the Great, a drone came out and destroyed it to amp up a brief moment of dread. Or imagine a chamber occupied by a Rapture civilian who refuses to move and needs to be killed for us to get access to it. This death could actually count into the Eleanor branching choice plot, and all of a sudden the decision branching can be made to extend further than the big cinematic moments where we're given a choice to forgive or take out vengeance on those who wronged us in the past. The punishments eked out by the games when the failure state is met tells you a lot about what the developers prioritized in the experience. Bioshock clearly feels that momentum, flow, is important to be maintained, and while I'm not against this, I do wonder what would have happened if resource management was more the focus. The concept of resource management has an interesting relationship with the Shock games, and the integration of this feature is usually to dedicate builds. So, in System Shock 2, different weapons took different ammo, but if you took the energy weapon path, your relationship to the environment changed, because not only do you need to find ammo, or batteries, but you can also recharge in charging stations strewn around the place for you to find. The Bioshocks don't even go this far, because the cinematic presentation and the focus on player expression over game direction had the teams prioritize letting the player flow in and out of different paths through the levels, rather than asking the player to commit to a build whose viability they couldn't be sure of from the get-go. I realize that it might sound like I'm asking Bioshock to be a survival horror franchise, and while I think that might be good, might not though, I'm not criticizing the game for not fulfilling this imported expectation of mine. yeah, I'd like to see what this series could be like if they maybe leaned more into the fact that it's a direct descendant of Thief the Dark Project and maybe was more about exploration, stealth, and horror than combat, but I get that that's not what the Bioshocks are. These games have all the mechanics on hand to actually devote themselves to the immersive sim sensibilities of their predecessors, but they don't because that's not their angle. From memory, there's only one sequence in the entire game where the telekinesis plasmid can be used to advance, and that's when we have to dislodge the wrench from the gears near the very start of the game. In a more dedicated immersive sim, you should have also been able to just shoot the wrench to have it move, or maybe pick up an item and throw it to get the job done, but the sequence was not designed to let the player get creative with the game's mechanics. It was designed to teach the players how to use that plasmid. There's a sequence just like it in the first game, where we need to get the telekinesis plasmid to grab a grenade thrown at us by an enemy and hurl it at debris which is blocking our path. In an immersive sim, assumably you'd just be able to stand near the debris, have the enemy throw the grenade at you, and the explosion should do the rest, but the point of the sequence was to make sure we knew how to use the plasmid before advancing, so the explosion does not clear the path unless we throw the bomb. The evolution of the Shock series shows a clear shift away from immersive sim sensibilities. Infinite owes more to Call of Duty than it even does the first Bioshock, and a move towards the idea of exploring meta-narratives. Judas, Ken Levine's next game, is not out as of the writing of this video, but it is seemingly fulfilling on the ambitions which Infinite originally tried to, where the story is the interactive component rather than the environment or the specific paths we take to reach a specific point. Bioshock as a license has imported a lot of the old immersive sim staples, but it's seemingly not in service of any specific ambition of the game other than having unique combat. A lot of these mechanics could make for great immersive sim sandboxy fun or great survival horror, but that's not what these games are about, and that's fine. Bioshock is allowed to be a more cinematic, audience-friendly experience than the System Shocks were without us having to pester them about it. Though, I do think it's funny that in a game set in the ruins of a free market utopian city, money basically does not matter. It's just there to be collected, and to stock up on healing kits, Eve, and ammo. I get that back in the days of the System Shocks, a lot of the sections, like the VR hacking in the first game, could get pretty tiresome pretty quickly, and that scrounging around for resources and not being able to utilize the weapons and powers you wanted just because you didn't have enough resources to unlock those could be a drag at times, but the cumulative impact those restrictions had on the experience lead to a much larger system with a lot more unique forms of player expression and game direction. The Bioshocks are content to let the player do anything, but this isn't what the Shock series started out like. Compared to the older titles, the economy has been almost completely decoupled from the game direction. Back in the days of System Shock 2, hacking was a viable skill, if only because it gave you access to cheap wares in the vendors. That game made you have to commit to your build of choice because there was no way to excel at everything. One way the build paths were limited was with the inventory. That game had a cap on the amount of things you could physically carry, so loot gobbling everything you saw was a really bad way to try to play that game. The Bioshocks don't have any inventory management, so you have no reason not to pick everything up, and since you have so many guns and since there's so much loot about in these games, the idea of a hacker build is kind of a joke, because there's really no trade-off to be made other than some gene tonics. You can still use all the weapons you want and the plasmids you have access to, and because of this, the economy of the Bioshock games feels kinda like an addition to justify giving the player money, which entices the player to explore the areas. System Shock 2's economy was not the deepest system in the world or anything, but it impacts a given playthrough of that game in more drastic ways than I can say for the economy here. This is not a knock on the Bioshock formula, but it is notable that as the Bioshocks streamlined the experience, they lost a lot of the levers they could pull at the players with, and because of this, the creatives have fewer ways to express themselves with game direction. This is offset somewhat though by the generally speaking higher quality of the game direction. But if we're talking about Bioshock and game direction, we need to talk about the quest arrow. The quest arrow is the cardinal sin of the Bioshock license. It helps direct the pace of the experience and make sure the player always has a heading, but for immersive purposes, I feel it is actually better to have the player slow down, take the environment in, and actually have to listen to the NPCs and the audio logs to piece together where they need to go. Bioshock is a more cinematic experience than System Shock, and I'm not so much speaking against the more handholdy approach, but I really wish they'd have just trusted in their level designers, because turning the arrow off actually shows just how strong the levels are and how they naturally funnel you into the correct heading. You are kind of nuts into playing as a loot sponge, so you'll probably go everywhere anyways, and I guess the best thing I could say for the arrow is that it lets you explore very deep into the level without ever getting lost, since you have a floating orientation device on your HUD at all times, and maybe removing it would disincentivize the exploration, but in that case, there are more elegant solutions. Like, imagine if the arrow would instead be a compass attached to the player's hand, which would always point back to the beginning of each level. Or maybe it would point back to an orientation beacon in the level, which the player needs to manually activate. Kinda like the resurrection chambers from System Shock 2 I mentioned earlier. Also, that would increase the interactive things to do in the levels and could give the developers another constant to use for level design and player direction. For example, if these orientation beacons would be plopped into prominent locations in the levels, maybe right at the start of them, or where the big branching off from the central path happens. That way, the most important areas are always at the player's fingertips, but the function of the arrow wouldn't really come in during the first go-through of an area. The audio logs and environmental design would direct the player from the central hub area, and the arrow would not do anything until after the quest variable has been updated. This might change up the best practices for level design, but I feel the areas already have a lot of hubs which branch into different hallways which lead back to the same hub to the next hallway thing going on here, and I don't know how much you'd need to change things level design wise to plop these beacons down in those hubs. You could also integrate it into the challenge where you can choose to not use them. And, showing my survival horror loving hand here, maybe you'd need to actually fork over a bit of cash to activate them. And then they would even make sense ludologically. Rapture is a very cramped and claustrophobic city, and there's not much in the way of horizontal landmarks for you to orient your way around, and in the free market paradise, building these beacons might actually be financially lucrative because this way of designing spaces is great at disorienting people and getting them lost. But I might actually be making a fatal error in pitching this, because I'm assuming the quest arrow is there for orientation in the first place, when that might not actually be what's up. What if the arrow is there for items? Quest items glow to highlight that they should be interacted with, but even that might not be enough to draw attention to them in the moment. You didn't need this sort of highlighting in the System Shock days because there was never too much clutter on the screen to disorient the player, but in Bioshock, there's so much trash around that asking the player to sift through it all would be quite an ask, and since outside of looting, the developers don't make physically interacting with the environmental clutter a big part of the game, the only times when the player is looking at the environment as something to be interacted with in that way is when they are advancing the main quest. So the player has one mental schema for interacting with the environment 99% of the time. But then we get to do the quest advancement triggers, and all of a sudden the player is asked to apply a different schema. That's a great way to disorient and baffle your players, and if this was why the quest arrow was implemented, it just goes to show that graphical improvements are not universally a positive for game design. And although I don't really love the quest arrows, if the alternative was to spend maybe an extra hour after the entire experience was tallied up, looking for the right thing to interact with, assuming also that we remove the highlighting glow, then I gotta say I'd rather just have the arrow. And there's actually some hint that the arrow might have been implemented to avoid asking the player to swap out the schemas they use to compartmentalize the world in the Little Sisters harvesting section, because those give us a scent to follow which leads us to the next Atom Corpse. The protection minigame added to the Little Sisters was rationalized by the developers to have been an attempt to actually build a bit of a bond between the Little Sisters and the players, which was lacking in the first game. But while I do like the inclusion of this extra Little Sister activity, I can't say I'm feeling that much more attached to them this time around. I do like that we get to see the relationship of the Big Daddy and the Little Sister from their perspective, much longer than in the first game where this was just explored briefly in the ending, but even though I like the protection sections, I don't think their inclusion is enough to increase the bond building. I've talked a lot about resource management already, my apologies. But the most important resource in the game is Adam, and we get it from the Little Sisters. And while I don't think the gameplay changes made to the Little Sisters sections does a lot to endear me more to them than in the first game, I do think the solutions to the Little Sister problem makes for a great addition to the license. So, the problem is that these girls should have all grown up, and they did. So Lamb sent the grown-up Little Sisters to the surface in order to steal more girls to keep the Adam economy alive. The Big Sisters might be the best new inclusion, which this game introduces to the license, and for a hypothetical return to Rapture, a Bioshock 3 that's also in Rapture, I'd love it if they were made to be the central figures. It makes sense setting-wise because after the Lamb family collapses, the Big Sisters are by far the most powerful faction, and they have a sort of tragedy to them like the Big Daddies, where they have been genetically and mentally altered to perform a function which is evil at its core. So the Big Daddies are meant to protect the Little Sisters, and even now, 10 years on, they still linger about trying their best to do just that. And even though you recognize that the Little Sister phenomenon as a whole ought to have been long since aborted, you can still recognize that there's something quite beautiful about the Big Daddy-Little Sister relationship, and there's something quite tragic about watching these brainwashed monsters continue to perform their functions. And the Big Sisters are the same. They protect the Little Sisters when the Big Daddies fail. So, if we put down all the Big Daddies in a given area and harvest or rescue all the Little Sisters, there's a fun sequence where the screen goes wild and we hear loud screeching sounds and are given a bit of time to prepare ourselves before we get hunted down by a Big Sister. I love that inclusion quite a lot. And story-wise, I think there's something interesting about a third Rapture Bioshock diving deeper into these humans who've been programmed to do all of these evil things. The Big Daddies protect the Little Sisters, the Big Sisters go to the surface and steal children so that the Adam economy can survive. Since Bioshock is not about ideology as much as idealogue, doing things you think are right and not ever questioning yourself, this dynamic seems to have a lot of fertile ground for more exploration. Ryan and Lamb were both people whom you could try to reason with, but I think since the idealogue not ideology point is still so neglected, even though Ken Levine has explicitly stated this to be the point, maybe making the villain of the next game be basically automatons might finally affirm this reading, because that setup would make the point a bit more explicit. Kinda like how Dark Souls 3 just did Dark Souls 1 again, but was more obvious about its themes because people didn't get them the first time around. Then again, I don't know if making automatons be the main baddies in a Bioshock game is the right approach. I think when you look at the best sequences in this license, you can't help but notice that Bioshock is at its best when the madness of the characters and their refusal to stay grounded to reality is allowed to color the world. If you poll Bioshock fans on what they want from the license moving forward, either A, another game set in Rapture, or B, a new city with a new philosophy, the majority will tell you that they'd prefer B, the new city. I understand the sentiment, but I very much disagree with it. There's many pros and cons to either approach, but one argument has always stuck out to me. I've been told that going back to Rapture is a limiting approach for the license to take because it locks it down in terms of the things it can explore. I see where this take is coming from, but I actually think it's the other way around. The whole "there's always a man, always a city, always a lighthouse" thing they had going on in Bioshock Infinite reduces the license down to these interchangeable variables of new city and new crazy setting with new ideology and new powers. That's when you really limit the license. Same story of a failed society in an extreme location, over and over again with new visuals. Continuing the story of Rapture, however, lets you build on what has happened before, and there's a certain amount of character baked into the environment when it's had time for new regimes to crop up. This is something I love about Bioshock 2. I talked about it earlier, but it warrants repeating. The environments have 3 layers going on at all times. They present the objectivist utopia, then there's the ruins of that society, and on top of that is the new collectivist utopia. And I don't know if this many layers of society could really read if they had to start all over again from the ground up. Once again, if this was your first Bioshock, and you were able to pick up on this depth, and you didn't get lost in the chronology or the history of the place, let me know. There's many possible merits to the New City, New Philosophy framework, but I'm more interested in seeing just how much crazier things can get here. Also, I feel like the setting has so much untapped potential. Not that Bioshock 2 is lacking on this front. Far from it. One of the benefits of the more cinematic presentation style of the Bioshocks over the System Shocks is that the tighter scenario direction makes way for a lot of really engaging set pieces. I find that with video game set piece moments, the more out-of-game elements are introduced to deliver, the less I tend to like them. So if the game is about walking around, searching for loot and audio logs and utilizing the environments to fight enemies, like Bioshock 2 is, I would really rather not they introduce time travel midway through, unless they keep that mechanic in subsequent sections as well. I feel like the set pieces of a given game ideally should be cobbled together from a clever utilization of the mechanics the player already has access to at all times. And this is where Bioshock 2 gets a gold star. Sure, a lot of the time we're just locked in a room while a character animates from the other side of a window or a screen and we're made to wait out their dialogue, but the big sister section near the start of the game, the little sister section near the end of the game, the underwater sections, the flooded sections, the prison sections, which I find gets a lot of mileage by placing non-aggro enemies around to show how broken the prisoners have been mentally, this is the stuff I really like. I think my dislike of out-of-game elements being introduced to deliver on the set pieces has to do with how it almost always just highlights how little grasp the developers have of the expressive capabilities of the mechanics they have access to. And if you want to see a really egregious example of this in the Bioshock series, think about how the combat in Bioshock Infinite begins after we're asked to throw a baseball, and that instead of having us utilize the first-person shooting mechanics to do it, the game makes it a button prompt choice. There's a whole meta-narrative in that game about video games and fake choices and such, but even if we want to fold that decision into that aspect of that narrative, while the button prompt is a more pronounced representation of the choice actually being a false choice, letting the player throw the ball themselves only to be stopped wherever they decide to throw it would, I think, impart the same message. Might not be as overt, but then the video games and fake choices conversation isn't revealed to have been happening until the ending of the game anyway, so it's not like the player would have missed that the choice was fake. Maybe they wouldn't have compartmentalized that as having been a choice, which might explain why they made the choice moments as overt as they do, but I like to think gamers are a bit more ludologically literate than that, and even if they aren't, I'd still prefer that the game not talk down to them like that, and instead let them interact with the mechanics they use in the rest of the game. And if you really want to make the player make choices without utilizing combat, maybe integrate mechanics which facilitate that into the game, and have them actually inform the entire experience, rather than just be little detours you bring up whenever you feel your core mechanics aren't up to the task of delivering on the sequence you want to include in your game. Bioshock 2 actually does this quite well, and while the narrative doesn't fold in on itself to explore the meta-narrative of games like the first Bioshock and Infinite do, the staging for the choices is always folded into the natural core mechanics of the game. So, when we choose whether or not to kill someone who wronged Subject Delta in the past, we do so by either inflicting violence upon them or not. See Stanley Poole. He's the morality choice character of Dionysus Park and promises to unlock the trains for us so that we can advance if we empty Dionysus Park of its little sisters. The little sisters have the atom which has the memories of his betrayal, and he's trying to use us to cover his track. Poole is ultimately not a very complicated or deep character, but here we actually learn quite a bit about Subject Delta. We learn that before coming to Rapture he was a deep-sea diver, and that on one of his dives he found Rapture and became something of a local celebrity whom the media nicknamed Johnny Topside. Ryan was convinced that he was a spy, so he had him arrested. Anyways, Dionysus Park has a nice flooded appearance which makes it stand out quite a bit, and it ends with Lamb messaging us and telling us that she knows about Stanley's betrayal and that she's forgiven him, but that since he aids us and compromises Eleanor, she opens up the door to his chamber and reveals that he was the one who turned Johnny Topside over to Ryan and sealed our fate to become a Big Daddy. This is a fun example of Lamb sacrificing human life to safeguard her philosophy of preaching that people ought to treat one another with love. The choice to kill Stanley is not presented with the same button prompt format which the Little Sister's rescue harvesting section has. He's just standing there cowering in front of us, and we can either kill him or not. Even the Alex the Great section had the button prompt morality choice be masked behind an actual in-universe button prompt. The harvest/saving the Little Sisters choice is a bit different since that's a literal button prompt, but that the treatment of the Little Sisters is folded into a higher order choice branching tree which dictates the lessons Eleanor will take from our journey, I find more than redeems how we need to interact with the Little Sisters with special use mechanics. Also, they're one example and are mostly optional, so I can't really get upset when I get the different interface for interaction. Like, I feel like I justifiably can when these sorts of special case interactions are dumped on me in the middle of a main story set piece moments all the time. Another reason I don't really love it when out-of-game mechanics are brought in for special case interactions is that they highlight that the schema I'm using to navigate the world isn't broad enough for the functions of the story. The gold standard for this stuff is the work of Fumito Ueda. In Shadow of the Colossus, I can use a bow. I can move, ride a horse, use a sword, and climb and jump and redirect sunlight, and affording me those activities is enough for that game to tell its story. The activities the player has access to seriously informs the setting, and when a special case function would be useful in other aspects of the game, but is locked from me unless the developers need me to use it for their special story moment, there's a sense that the world I'm interacting with isn't realized enough since the gameplay I interact with it through 98% of the time isn't enough to present the entirety of the world, and the 2% special case functions are taken away from me because the usual game moments can't function if I have access to those. So yeah, the gameplay schema informs the setting, and since Bioshock 2 is almost exclusively about looting the desolate ruins of the place or killing the enemies found there, Rapture reads exactly as what it is. And all of the phenomena in the game which we have access to often betray their intended functions and instead serve to highlight the attitude of the city as it exists right now, and the attitude it imposes on us and the other survivors. Trash cans are no longer places to rid yourself of garbage, they are canisters to loot for precious resources. Oil is not fuel, it's a way to burn enemies, etc. Everything either feeds into the chaotic violence or it goes ignored. Something I commend the Bioshock series for, which I unfortunately can't say for a lot of immersive sims, is that these games don't go for generic visuals. Quality notwithstanding, there's a lot of immersive sims out there who play out in the least interesting spaces you can imagine. I recently got started playing the System Shock 1 remake, and I might make a video on that one day, and while I enjoyed the time I spent with it so far, I really feel it doesn't escape the issue I had even with the original way back when I played it, which was that the environments bleed into each other a lot. The space station setting lends itself to feeling very mass-manufactured and claustrophobic, so it's not like this is an oversight or anything, but with the Bioshocks, since they take place in cities, you get a lot of visual variety, and each section is able to solidify much more of an identity for itself. The space setting justified the isolation of the experience before, and made sure the players never started poking holes with questions like, when's the cavalry coming, or why don't I just leave? But I feel the settings are also very restricted on the visual identity of each section. That's also got to do with the function of the setting though. The System Shocks take place in space stations and spaceships. Every inhabitant of those areas is on board for the function they provide to the Enterprise. The Bioshocks taking place in cities means you can explore the stories of people, disconnected from how they relate to the locations the games take place in. The best stories here are the ones which show the evil of the setting inflicting horrors on the people, but the setting has a much broader scope than before. It's not separated into just medbays, engineering rooms, sleeping quarters, storage, etc. We now have amusement parks, entertainment districts, and that diner I talked about. I love the diner. Did I talk about that diner? And this is something I do quite appreciate about Bioshock 2. Quality of the level design and scenario direction may not reach the heights of the original Bioshock, but the locations themselves expand on the city in interesting ways, like the metro. Of course Rapture would have a metro system, but then everyone got personal bathyspheres to sail around, but the metro lingered because it had actually kind of just been grandfathered so deeply into the infrastructure. I'd have actually loved it if one section of the game took a page from Metro 2033's book and had us walk through a metro track, which had maybe become occupied by splicers in a big turf war between two sections of the city. Probably that kind of section would work better in a game with more heavier duty stealth mechanics, hint hint, future Bioshock devs, but sadly we can't have everything. The choice of Art Deco architecture is also great because the Bioshocks look like no other games. It's also good because the entire city having the same architectural style ensures the generic clutter objects from one area are probably not going to stand out in any other. Generic objects and geometry pieces are the most important ones in any game because they're going to be seen thousands of times by the same player in 1,000 different contexts, and they need to be generic enough, in contrast to the rest of the environment, to not call attention to themselves, while also being robust enough to fit into any place on the map they are used in. For objects the player is intended to interact with, like trash cans or health vendors, the same rules apply, except they should maybe call some attention to themselves, meaning they need to have something going on for themselves which makes them stand out from the clutter around them. Stuff like lights or special patterns are great here. The characters in the first Bioshock game are at their best when they bring out the horrors implicit in the setting. Andrew Ryan released the restraints, and everyone else drifted further and further away from sanity. Here, in Bioshock 2, Sophia Lamb is attempting to create a new kind of human being who is capable of embodying the philosophies she believes in, and the best moments with the characters in the city this time around is when they are confronted with the ramifications of Sophia's ambitions. In Bioshock 1, the horrors come about because Ryan doesn't reel in the people. Here, the horrors come about because everyone is being sucked into Sophia's plans. Stanley Poole might not have been the most interesting character in the game, but I do think it is sort of interesting to have him betray our surrogate in the world prior to us inhabiting him. Do you really have any sort of ownership over the life of Johnny Topside just because he used to occupy the body you're in now? It was an interesting moral conundrum, and I think it's also interesting that in this game, the case for killing the NPCs becomes stronger and stronger as the game goes on. So, outside of Grace trying to stop us in Pauper's Drop, we don't have any real reason to kill her. But Stanley had personally betrayed Subject Delta, and he had screwed over Eleanor. And the next kill or spare NPC, Gilbert Alexander, is the most morally complicated choice of the bunch. Because even if you take the principle that killing is wrong no matter what the other person does to you, Gilbert asks us to kill him. But the version we meet isn't the same man anymore, so whose request do we acquiesce to? Gilbert Alexander was a scientist before Rapture fell. He created a lot of the security systems in the place, so if I want to blame anyone for how under-highlighted hacking as a playstyle is, I have to blame him. And he was also heavily involved in the creation of the Big Daddies. He's actually the dude who created the method of pair bonding them with the Little Sisters. He was also personally involved with the creation of us, Subject Delta. The pair bonding technology he made for the Alpha series worked too well as the bonding was too deep. The Big Daddies failed to acclimate to more than one little sister, and if anything were to happen to them, the Alpha series would go berserk. These berserk leftovers of the Alpha series have since been weaponized, and they feature in this section of the game. Gil began to work with Sophia Lamb after the Rapture Civil War, and his story in the Rapture family I find to be the most interesting in the game because it really leans into the horror and the logical leaps afforded to the story by the license. Adam. Lamb guilted Gilbert into using himself as a guinea pig for her dream of creating the first utopian. Eleanor is to have her sense of self eradicated, and she's to be made to ingest the atom of Rapture's intellectual elite so that she can embody perfectly the philosophy of her mother and spread it across the world. But Gilbert Alexander is not Eleanor Lamb, and when he began experimenting on himself, he begins to transform into something deeply disturbing and unhinged. Lamb leaves him behind when she realizes that he's of no more use to her, and now he's the insane tyrant overseer of Fontaine Futuristics, the place he used to work at all those years ago. He goes by Alex the Great and is quite a standout character. Before going completely crazy, he recorded his transformation and he begs whoever might be listening to the recordings to kill him. Alex the Great lives in a giant water tank, and after luring him out by following the instructions left by Gilbert before he went off the deep end, we make a choice to either honor Gilbert's last wish and destroy what's left of him, or we can listen to the cries of the mad Alex the Great and spare him. This is the most complicated of the NPC moral choices in the game, but internally it's treated the same as killing either Stanley or Grace. This changes the ending we get and the lesson Eleanor draws from our experience in Rapture, but that doesn't mean that internally the game is making the moral decision that he ought to be spared or not. It's just that Eleanor will interpret our action one way or another. She's the reason we do anything, so I think this is a nice case of a deeply complicated moral choice which we can solve by appealing to the purpose given to our protagonist. We are here to save Eleanor, and we should be conducting ourselves in a manner which we would want for her to emulate. The characters here are very different from the ones in the first game, and I think the biggest contributor in this difference is that this game's ideology is collectivist in nature, whereas the first game's horror was individualistic. There, Dr. Steinman and Sandra Cohen explored the idea of artists who seemingly have begun to worship the conceptualization of transgressing against standards, and because they weren't Ryan's lackeys, the environment reflects their deranged attitudes much more than we get in Bioshock 2, where all the NPCs have the same power above them whose influence motivates all of them. Whether they are supportive of Lamb or not, they are still in her frame, which was not the case for the relationship the characters in the first game had with Ryan. Another design decision which sort of holds back how far these characters can go is that because the story is structured around giving us a choice to kill or spare NPCs, the NPCs need to have some redeemability or at least not be so obviously horrible that players can reasonably choose the path of non-violence. By design, Bioshock 2's characters are imminently more redeemable. This is going to land differently for different people, and while I don't hate this decision, I do feel the license lends itself better to showcasing how people can turn into monsters. The first game showed you the horrors of Rapture, and you kinda understood that maybe someone at some point should have started asking questions before things got out of hand the way they did. In Bioshock 2, the villains inherited the already collapsed city, so they can't really be blamed for the mess. They're very much stuck in the horror with us. When Ken Levine was being interviewed about having perhaps given Objectivism a bad rap in the first game, he explained that he felt, "The problem with any philosophy is that it's up to the people to carry it out. It could have been Objectivism. It could have been anything. It's about what happens when ideals meet reality. If you had to sum up Bioshock's story, that's what it is." He then went on to say, "When philosophers write books, when they write fictional works like Atlas Shrugged, they put paragons in the books to carry out their ideals. I always wanted to tell a story of what if a guy wasn't a paragon? What if his intentions were really good, but at the end of the day, he was human? It could have been Objectivism. It could have been anything." This philosophy of examining idealogue rather than the ideology returns for the second game, and I quite like how the villain this time around is philosophically in opposition to Andrew Ryan from the first game. He was the ultra-individualist, Sophia Lamb, the ultra-collectivist. Another returning theme from the first game is how the persecuted people of the surface world often become the tyrants on the bottom of the ocean. So Steinman, Cohen, and Tannenbaum were all Jewish. Suchong was Korean. Ryan was born in a Jewish family in the Russian Empire and lived to see the communist revolution which destroyed his home and caused him to leave the country. He has the same backstory as Ayn Rand herself, basically. And now in Bioshock 2, the people persecuted by Andrew Ryan have picked up the gauntlet and become tyrants as well. I noted Grace Holloway and Father Wales, but this also applies to Sophia Lamb, and perhaps even Eleanor, if we don't personally set a good example for her. The horror of Bioshock really takes advantage of the setting. Because Rapture is so isolated from the rest of the world, there's no cavalry coming to save the citizens when things go wrong, and because the insane engineering of Rapture required tight and claustrophobic spaces, all separated from one another with tight exterior corridors with heavy, sealable doors, there's not really all that much you can do to oppose the power above you here because the location is difficult to get around in. Then you have Adam, and something I really like about Sophia Lamb is how her ideology takes into account that this substance exists. The philosophy is very much molded by the environment of the world she lives in, and the sci-fi make-believe phenomena of the brand is feeding into the capacity for storytelling. It's like how the live stream in Final Fantasy VII made it possible to do certain things with the story, or how the Force in Star Wars allows our characters to get information they otherwise wouldn't have had no way of obtaining, and allows them to speed through some of the physical and character development which they might otherwise be bogged down in. Adam opens up a lot of doors for Bioshock, and it's cool that Sophia Lamb's ideology has factored in this unique mechanic of the world. And of course, since Lamb needs the atom, she crosses boundaries to keep the atom economy alive. I already talked about how she sent the Big Sisters to the surface to kidnap little girls, because no one in Rapture is making babies, and I once again must stress how much I love the idea of the Big Sister, and how I think it's a phenomenal example of how much more there is to be gotten from the license by keeping the story centered around Rapture rather than finding a new setting with a new ideology every time. I like the idea of Rapture as this mystical, remote land where dreamers go to escape the world, only to discover that they're also a part of the world, and rebelling by trying to remake human beings with Adam in order to better conform to their demands of the world. In the first game, we can find audio logs where we see that Ryan had conflicts with himself because his individualism often clashed with the pragmatic reality of governing the city, and I think that added a layer of humanity and sympathy to him. He wasn't a good guy, but you can see how under different circumstances he could have been. It wasn't so much that he was evil as it was that things got out of hand, and he chose to follow his heart rather than his head. Which is why I think Lamb is not as interesting of a villain. In Ryan, we saw a genuine conflict between his avowed love of the best of humanity and his need to subjugate and control the masses. Lamb, on the other hand, seems to not really have those moments where she lets the mask slip. She talks about loving humanity, but her plan is to change them. She's perfectly willing to have us kill Stanley Poole just for slighting her plans. She's willing to abandon Gilbert Alexander in his time of greatest need, when he's sacrificed everything for her dream. He's of no more use to her, so why should she stick around? She speaks of family love, but, and I cannot stress this enough, she's literally sacrificing her only daughter. If she had moments where she acknowledged and struggled with the contradictions, I think I would have a lot more sympathy for her, but as it is, for me, she doesn't quite reach the heights Ryan did. Even so, I like her as a character. It's clear by her actions that she doesn't actually love humanity, she loves her ideology. The term telescopic philanthropy is apt to describe Lamb because all of her attention and compassion is focused on the distant, abstract suffering of the world, while the people who struggle around her are being destroyed, and she does not care. Because we see the license tackle the idea of ideologue from more than one perspective, I feel the duo package of Bioshock 1 and 2 manages to explore the underlying horror much better than either game can by themselves. The philosophy motivating our villains is the exact opposite, but they both still believe themselves to be absolutely right. Neither Ryan nor Lamb is interested in questioning their biases, or interested in admitting that they might be wrong. Both of them have had cumulative life experiences which they believe justify their beliefs and actions, and they've both developed all of the mental tricks needed to shield their perfect ideology from criticism. Since neither one is willing to admit that they might be wrong, we have a scenario where the only force capable of rendering the verdict of truth is reality itself. These ideas are forced to play out, and because both the brutal setting and Adam extend the lengths to which these beliefs can be taken, by the time reality finally gets a word in, what's left is often not much more than rubble and the rotting remains of the mutilated and deformed citizens of Rapture. We finally meet up with Eleanor in Persephone, where she is being held by her mother. To stop us from advancing any further, Sophia smothers and kills Eleanor, which shuts down our body as well and knocks us out, long enough for Sophia to remove the pair bonding we had with Eleanor. Eleanor then sends a little sister to harvest our Adam, which allows us to take control over her, and here it's revealed that Eleanor has been using the little sisters, whom she is connected to watch us. If you had been mistreating them, this might be the moment where you finally caught on that your choices actually do matter, and you might have tried finding some ways to make amends, but it's too late. There are no more NPCs to save, and no more little sisters to find. Eleanor's fate is set in stone. In the body of the little sister, we gather up a big sister armor for Eleanor, and after we return to our body, we get a plasmid which summons Eleanor to fight by our side. I'm a big fan of the decision to have Eleanor's inclusion be locked behind a plasmid. She's strong enough to solo the rest of the game, so if you want to tackle that on your own, you have the choice to not summon her. You might also not want to play Subject Delta as someone who'd allow his daughter to join in on the killing, so if that's the case, you can choose not to summon her. Having the player control when Eleanor is active allows them to control the flow of things, which I really like, and on top of that, having it be locked behind a plasmid of all things goes back to what I said earlier about how I hate when games do spectacle by temporarily becoming different games because their existing mechanics weren't strong enough or because the devs were not thinking in terms of their core mechanics deeply enough to present a scenario with the mechanics the players have already intuited. We make our way out with Eleanor to Sinclair's escape pod, but Sophia Lamb decides enough is enough and that she'd rather destroy us and Eleanor than allow for her plans to be thwarted. She sets off bombs which will send us to the bottom of the ocean, and she also sends Sinclair to kill us. He's been transformed into a Big Daddy, and while he doesn't have the will to resist Sophia's Lamb command to kill us, he does still ask us to stop him and put him down because he doesn't want to live as a slave. Shock series alumni had every reason to doubt Sinclair's sincerity from the get-go because when these games give us radio partners, they usually do so to have those partners betray us. See Shodan, see Atlas. A funny thing about Atlas actually is that Sinclair is kind of built on his scraps. Atlas was originally intended to have a southern accent, but playtesters felt he wasn't trustworthy enough, so they changed it to Irish. We learn in the course of this game that Sinclair's plans are to strip Sophia Lamb of power, then strip Rapture of everything it's worth and sell the technology off to the surface world. And because everything had been set up to make us doubt Sinclair, for me, it is the most emotional moment in the game when Sophia sicks him on us and he genuinely actually just asks us to kill him so that he can die a free man. Interestingly, this is almost the same scenario as the Gilbert-Alexander moral conundrum, so it's strange that the game does not present this as a moral conundrum. I suppose, since Sinclair hasn't lost his mind yet, and it's actually him asking us to kill him, that's different from the Alex the Great section, but even then, the entire game had up until this point been very interested in making the player think about the morality of killing named NPCs anyways, so it's interesting that this section isn't dragged on a bit. I wonder if there was more planned here or if my hypothesized consideration for flow once again might have been what gave us the sequence we got. I suppose this setup does make a strong case for Bioshock's strongest connecting theme, which is its love of choice. Sinclair asks us to kill him because he doesn't want to live as a slave. Bioshock 1 and Infinite explore the idea of choice with the meta-narratives about player agency, and the closest Bioshock 2 comes to meditating on this idea in a meta way is when Eleanor talks to us about love. That love is just a chemical, but it matters because we choose to give it meaning. I don't think the following is the case, but if this line was intended to comment on the nature of the video game player relationship, it might be saying that while the experience is completely artificial, you can choose to take meaning out of it, which makes it real in a different, abstract way. Subject Delta is an interesting protagonist, and just like how Lamb mirrors Ryan, Delta mirrors Jack. Jack had tattoos of chains on his arms, which symbolized his lack of agency over his own affairs. But Delta has the Greek letter delta stamped on his suit. Delta is the mathematical symbol for change, and the choices we make will come to change Eleanor and the fate of those we encounter in our experience. Bioshock 1's good ending is shown by Jack's ability to reject pure self-interest. If he is egalitarian and saves the little sisters, he rises above the Rapture nightmare. Bioshock 2 switches the polarity of the political persuasion of our villain and hero to deliver the same point about idealogue. Subject Delta is constantly being criticized by the game's actors as a representative of the systems that made him. The other characters often have that demeaning and dehumanizing view of Delta, but it's much more a statement about them and their need to put themselves above us, in order to justify to themselves the pain they try to inflict on us. But Delta rises above the Rapture horror because of his individualism. because he and Eleanor are able to reject collectivist utopianism and focus on their own ambitions for freedom. And I think that's really sweet. It stays true to the message of the first game by hammering it home from the opposite philosophical persuasion. To secure our exit from Rapture, we need to flood Persephone, another fun interior flooded segment which I like. But the bombs go off while we make our way to the escape pod and we are mortally wounded. We grab on to the escape pod and as we rise with it to the surface, we watch the city disappear underneath us. Sophia Lamb's fate will be decided upon by the actions we took when we had the choice to harvest or rescue the little sisters, and by the way we treated the NPCs. Eleanor will either give her mother an oxygen mask or will let her drown in the pod. When we've breached the surface, we are near death's door, and there are some different conclusions to the story. In the good ending, Eleanor will extract our atom. This will give her our memories and will let us live on as her conscience as she prepares to embark on the next step of her journey, entering the surface world. In the bad ending, Eleanor will harvest us like how we harvested the little sisters, and she'll be reborn on the surface as a monster. If we showed mercy in our journey, we'll get to make the choice of giving Eleanor our atom or not. Earlier I talked about how Bioshock 2 dedicates itself to the theme of parentage more than the other Bioshocks do. The most iconic imagery of the Bioshock license is almost certainly the big daddies holding hands with the little sisters, and that this is the final scene here on the surface, the relationship between the big daddies and the little sisters have with one another, forms the backbone of the experience in this game, and even though the duo are a horrific and monstrous sight, there's an undeniable humanity to it, and I think it's wonderful that the second game chose to hone in on this. A dark image which hides a very real humanity, which is what I feel is at the core of the Bioshock license. Will this be a big feature in Bioshock Infinite? Do I even want to make a video on Infinite? Not really, but I probably will one day. That game is such a bundle of compromises made to get the thing shipped out the door, so I feel bad whenever I talk about it because I really don't like it, but I think I would have fallen in love with the game the team was originally making. I was glued to the production and absorbed every last ounce of pre-release information I could. As for Bioshock 2, we've done it. I made the video, it's done. I'm sorry it took me 6.5 years, but there you go. You know, all the usual stuff. If you want to support the video, be sure to mess around with all the little bits and bobs and like and comment and subscribe, etc. You can also show appreciation by joining the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. Look at all of these beautiful names running up and down your screen right now. So many beautiful names, so many beautiful people, and it could be you, if you don't mind throwing in $1 or $2 to see these videos early. What else? You can join the channel Discord if you want to have more in-depth conversations than what the YouTube commenting system enables. You can check out the demo for my game once it's out. You can have a good day. That's always important. You can check out the conversation I recorded with the Daydream cast. You can have a good day. Did I say that? Maybe go to a diner. Have a good day in a diner. It's late. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.